Hello, welcome to the AskHistorians podcast. This week we are thrilled to have the host of EdHistory 101 podcast and great AskHistorians Flair member, your accountability buddy, who is better known as Jen Bennis. We have a great podcast for you today. We literally trace the entire history of education in America and really dive deep into some of the weeds of discussion. I think you will enjoy it greatly. Please do go and subscribe to EdHistory 101 wherever you get your podcasts, and also please support us on patreon.com/AskHistorians, as it really does help to keep the show going ad-free and lets us bring you great content every week now with the launch of our Ask Historians Aloud initiative. We are also launching a quick 2-minute poll on the podcast, so if you could please stop by and the thread on Ask Historians sometime this week and take it. It would greatly help us in improving the show and taking it where you guys want to see it go. And for that, here is the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast and to one of our very few crossover episodes. I am pleased to be your host this week, Brian Watson, and today we are joined by Ask Historian member, your accountability buddy, who is better known to her friends and family as Jen Bennis. She is flared on Ask Historians as History of Education, and she runs the education history podcast EdHistory 101 with her husband. And she's joining us today to talk about the history of education in America. First things first, welcome to the Ask Historian podcast, Jen.
Well, thank you very much.
So I generally like to begin these interviews by asking, what got you interested in history in general?
The short answer is feminism. I'm a late in life, openly feminist person as I move through this world. And I started to just kind of explore feminist philosophers, getting into feminist history. And it didn't take me long to kind of cross over into American education. For pretty much the duration of American education, it's been a female-dominated profession, except for a short period in the beginning. And so feminism and education kind of go hand in hand. And there's a great book by an author named Dana Goldstein, which serves as a wonderful primer for education history for feminism, called The Teacher Wars. It's a history of America's most embattled profession. And it basically gives the overview of the intersection of feminism, the teaching profession, and then the education system writ large.
If I may ask, how did you get to feminism that much later in life? Usually people tend to discover it in high school or college in some senses, but it sounds like you came to it later on.
I was a feminist to a certain extent as a younger person, but I didn't have the language for it. So it took me until, my mid-30s, about a decade ago, for me to start to find the language to describe who I wanted to be as a person moving through this world. So I was very much involved in social justice issues in college, but I didn't have the language for it. So it took me a while to find the words. And now that I have the words, I won't stop talking about the words.
How would you describe feminist?
For me, a lot of what I wrestle with is the whole issue of intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw's theory around the intersection of different systems on Black women, on women of color. And so I identify as a feminist who is white. I'm very much afraid of the consequences of white feminism, but I don't feel that I own the language of intersectional feminism or of womanism. So I'm a feminist who is white, who very often gets things wrong and just tries to learn and do the best that I can. And so for me, a huge part of education history is about recentering the margins of American education history, because too much of it is focused on, well, frankly, white men. So let's shift that narrative. And so that's a lot of what I focus on in my writing and in the podcast.
So your podcast is, first of all, fantastic, but I'm interested in how you came about with the idea of actually start a podcast. It's not something everybody does every day.
And it kind of came about because of a couple of different podcasts. I am a huge podcast junkie. And when I do, my day job is to support teachers with curriculum design. So I spend my days with teachers and supporting teachers. And I was a former teacher myself. And I tell my teachers that I have 2 cats, no kids, and a husband who cooks. So I have a fair amount of discretionary free time. And I became big into podcasts. And there's a great podcast called Sawbones. Which is basically a husband and wife conversation. Sydney is a primary care physician, and she talks to their husband about medical history. And I thought, hey, that's a model that could work for us because my husband has nothing to do with education. He works in the automotive industry, so he knows nothing about education, and he hated school. So we were sitting down one night and I said, tell me all the things you hated about school. And that was the basis for our first season, investigating all of the things that he didn't like about school. And it gave me kind of an in for research.
So how did your husband feel about being kind of a guinea pig for educational history?
He's a very good sport. He's a very, very good sport.
Yeah, I have to say, it's been absolutely fascinating listening to both your interactions on the podcast and just how you presented educational history. Would you say you tend to go into the podcast with like a particular sort of viewpoint or mission you're trying to get out of it?
To a certain extent, a lot of what I'm trying to do is to challenge the danger of a single story, to challenge this idea of, education history is this. Well, actually, it's a bit more complicated. So that's a very kind of common phenomenon that happens in education reform, whether we say big R, like reformers, charter school advocates, voucher advocates who tend to identify as reformers, or just the evolution of education. A lot of what people like to do is to look back at the past and say, our schools are based on factories, or our schools are this, or schools are that. And I want to complicate that narrative.
When you do your research, how do you generally do it? Do you start off with a particular topic and like kind of draw from that?
A little bit of both. So I do have to out myself as I don't want to say self-taught historian. I don't know if that's an actual moniker. But one of the reasons I kind of paused on podcast recording is because I realized I might not be doing my due diligence, which is actually what brought me to the Ask Historians community. I knew I needed to get better at doing research.
Mhm.
So I used to start off and say, oh, I wonder this, and I'd go to an article. And then I started to realize that I need primary sources and maybe secondary sources. And I started to get better at reading primary sources. And then I started to understand that I need multiple sources from multiple perspectives. So my research methods are very much learn as I go. And I'm deeply grateful to the Ask Historians community who helped me inadvertently, unknowingly, kind of hone my researcher voice, because the feedback I got when I first applied for FLAIR was so spot on that it immediately helped me realize gaps in my own learning. So I worked on getting better at doing research. And so I created a few projects to kind of pursue just for fun related to education history, and then returned to, Ask Historians, hopefully getting better at answering questions.
Sure. That's really actually really amazing to hear. I'm really happy to hear that, especially as a moderator. Just from our perspective, sometimes you can see people apply for FLAIR who have no idea what they're doing or don't even take any of the critiques to heart. I'm really happy to hear that we've made a positive impact for you, but I know you've made a positive impact for the subreddit being around as well.
Oh, cool.
Would you mind talking a little bit about what brought you to Ask Historians? I would love to hear more about it.
About Ask Historians?
Yeah, what brought you there and how you got there?
Sure. So yes, I have a nemesis, and he doesn't know that he's my nemesis, but if we ever met in person, he would be my nemesis. And his name is John Taylor Gatto. And Gatto wrote a book called The Underground History of American Education. And what Gatto did was he started with this idea schools are bad. And he kind of dabbled in American history and said, I'm going to pull out this little fact and this little detail, and I'm going to string them together to make this narrative that I want to tell. And I was doing something, I was Googling something, and I saw Ask History. And in Ask History on Reddit, people were talking about the factory model and about Gatto, what a great historian he was. And I thought, this doesn't sound right to me. And someone linked to Ask Historians. And so then I went to Ask Historians and I saw the rigor of the answers. I saw how thoughtful everybody was. And I thought, this is the kind of thinker I want to be about education history. And seeing the different responses. So it's been really interesting for me to sometimes shift back and forth between Ask History and Ask Historians. And I much prefer Ask Historians.
I think everybody would say that.
Ask History. So So I really like, and it's interesting the patterns of the responses. I curate all the questions that I answer on my website at history101.com, just so I can keep a running list of all the things that I've answered.
Mm-hmm.
Which reminds me, I should make my flared user page.
I was just about to mention that we do have these wonderful thing called flared user pages, which anybody listening to can go and look at the entire history of things that people have answered.
Yeah,
it's very easy to just copy and paste from mine, and you can have one you're set up in 10 minutes.
I will add that to my to-do list. It's so fascinating for me. So many things that people think are absolutes about American education history. They think that this is what it is. Like, for example, one thing that comes up a lot is people will say, well, when did American schools start doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And 9 times out of 10, I have to say, well, there's really no such thing as American schools because we don't have a national education system.
Right.
So
right.
The phrase I mentioned the most is probably due to the 10th Amendment. It's up to the states.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it becomes kind of, well, I can talk about patterns across states, but I have to really be careful of East Coast bias. That happens a lot. There's been a couple of really interesting essays by educational historians where they talk about reconsidering American education history. And one of the things that they talk about is the East Coast bias, that we tend to think of Mann. We tend to think of Horace Mann. We tend to think of Boston. We tend to think of the way things happened here, I'm a New Yorker, as being absolute for the entire country, and it's simply not the case.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right there. So I'd like to actually get into that a little bit more, but I guess we should probably start at the beginning, if there's such a thing in America. Would you say American educational history began with the Puritans?
Well, it depends. I mean, there's, choir preaching to you and the listeners, there's always different narratives you can follow. So if we start strictly with the timeline, the first kind of mention of education on this soil was a letter from to the governor of the colony of Virginia, where he was advised what to do when he kidnaps indigenous children.
Oh my God.
And the advice was to educate them to be like Europeans, to be good Christians. So the first document related to education on the soil, the first kind of statement was about colonization and denying indigenous children their connections to their families and to, westernizing them. So that for me is a more powerful, important starting point than where a lot of people like to start, which is with Horace Mann, the 1830s, with jumping way ahead. So if we start from the beginning, the history of American education is in effect about keeping white children away from children of color. It's in effect about white supremacy and institutional sexism. But that's not as fun as to say as, the factory model or, the industrial era schools.
Right, of course.
So we go way back to the beginning.
Mm-hmm. How did it, can you talk a little bit about how American or Native education, I guess would be the word, kind of got started in the very beginning there?
Yeah, so there's each of the themes that we follow. So we can follow the theme of what happened to Native or Indigenous youth, and it really hit its low point, for lack of a better word, with the Indian industrial schools, which everyone has heard. Anyone involved in any American history has heard the Carlyle philosophy of, quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." That was probably the low point. But the theme starting back, in the 1630s was about westernization. Parallel to that is the education for white boys, which is very much about following in fathers' footsteps, access to privilege and power, maintaining the social structures, and then eventually income white girls. And then we have a huge demarcation between North and South when it comes to Black or African children about education.
Right, of course.
Each one of those is kind of we can follow these, and I'm making these hand gestures, which is always very helpful for podcasts. These timelines, you can follow different timelines throughout history.
So you do focus on white boys specifically. I'm assuming probably definitely in the South and probably in the North. Is that kind of the case up into the Revolutionary War, just to focus on educating little white boys to be better citizens, quote unquote?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. And what people will often glom onto, one of the things that people who want to change the current system will often point to is that literacy rates in America during the Revolutionary War and just after were amongst the highest in the world.
Hmm.
Virtually all white boys on American soil were literate, but there's the fact that literacy was defined a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And if we only count white boys, so with one of Gatto's favorite facts is to talk, or facts, quote unquote, is to talk about how literate colonial America was, and to a certain extent, it was. But if we only look at certain people, if we exclude girls, if we define literacy using a slightly different metric, so when we start to think about the education for white boys, we have this really sort of fascinating thing for me. Like the most like the one of the few times I felt my brain just kind of blow open is when I learned the average age at Harvard, I think in 1810, was 15 and a half.
Wait, what?
The average age at Harvard.
I mean, I heard you, but like,
I know, right? So we
how?
have this, yeah, we think of like Harvard as always being this post tertiary educational thing, but it was secondary school. It was young men went to Harvard whenever they went to Harvard. Some young men would study with a tutor for a year and pass Harvard's entrance exams. Some would go through Boston Latin for 4 years and then go to Harvard.
Hmm.
So one of the awesome questions that was asked once on Ask Historians was, where does the moniker freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior come from? So I bought a subscription to newspapers.com so that I could read Boston newspapers in the 1700s, where they talk about Boston sophomores. I think it was like sophomore. I haven't heard it said out loud. The spelling is a little bit different than the modern
Hmm.
spelling. So there's this, we have these mental models of what American education is. It's primary, secondary, tertiary, but it hasn't always been that way. And that for me is just fascinating.
What would a student of that time, I guess, either in Harvard or otherwhere, be studying? Would it be math and English and social studies like we do today, or would it have been different?
Well, generally speaking, a young white man who was studying at Harvard or one of the similar sort of places, generally speaking, be studying what we refer to as a classics curriculum. And a
Hmm.
classics curriculum was basically Latin and Greek. And the modern day evolution of this is what we have now in schools, which is the liberal arts curriculum, or it was known as the English curriculum for a period of time. So the classics curriculum was very much on Latin, Greek, some math, some sciences, but slowly we've evolved now to liberal arts, which is science, history, literature, mathematics, arts, and physical education. So
Hmm.
over time, we've kind of expanded our understanding of what it means to be a well educated person.
That's fascinating. And I guess kind of to where, if we're in our mental timeline of our heads, we're probably somewhere in right after this Revolutionary War, would you say?
Yeah, about that. After the Civil War, or excuse me, after the Revolutionary War, we
Hmm.
did have the evolution of, we started to get more schools, more charity funded schools. There was started to be a push. Thomas Jefferson pushed so hard for publicly funded schools. He never quite got there. He wasn't able to get any of his proposals passed, but the idea was emerging. Let's have this system where we work together to educate our boys, because of course this wasn't about daughters, and it wasn't about the black or enslaved children that were on the soil. So we're very much focused on this idea. So after the Revolutionary War is when the idea really started to take hold that maybe we collective should do something for the education of children and not leave it just up to the parents.
This kind of plays into all these kind of narratives of what it means to be an American and this whole idea of creating an American childhood, children, and citizenry, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's interesting. You would say women, especially, still aren't receiving education by this time. If that takes till after the Civil War, we start seeing education of women.
They were, but it was always in the service of their future life as a wife or a mother. One of my favorite quotes I came across was about how a woman should learn accounting in case she marries an accountant and he dies. And I always thought that was a great line. It was like 1790 or something, and I thought that's awesome. So there, but to be sure, there's always people are saying, yeah, but so for example, the Quakers, from practically the first moment Quakers were here on this soil, Quakers were advocating for gender equity in education.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't concerned so much with, their daughters' future in the same way that, Anglo-Saxon Protestants were. But the Quakers had this idea that girls' brains are just as important as boy brains.
Mm-hmm.
So let's educate our daughters the same way, and granted, we were not talking like full on gender equity, but it was Quakers were amongst those who were saying, hey, let's give girls access to education we give our sons.
That's interesting. And boys of color in the North, you had mentioned that they were started to receive education by now, or?
There's some interesting pockets. And on one hand, I'll say, let's not look too much at Boston. But on the other hand, let's look to Boston. There were African free schools in Boston and in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And they were oftentimes created by, not always, I mean, every school has its own story, but they were in several instances created by wealthy Black men or wealthy Black families who wanted to educate free Black youth. There were some schools. So, for example, the first push for integration of Boston schools happened in the early 1800s. There was a story, a court case about a girl who wanted to go to school in Boston, and her father had to walk her past 3 white-only schools in Boston
Mm-hmm.
before getting to her school, which was the Black-only school. And he went to court, and he wasn't successful. But the idea of integration started long before, the 1950s. It started, generations before that. So Boston and New York had these pockets, and integration did happen. There are some amazing stories of what Black women were doing. There's a great book. I have to be careful not to become too much of a book pusher, but there's a great book by a woman named Heather Andrea Williams called Self-Taught. Mm-hmm. And she details the history and the efforts of African Americans striving for education throughout all of American history. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating and frustrating to see how hard our fellow Americans have had to fight to give their children access to resources that white Americans have taken for granted since the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And in the South.
And in the South. And in the South, it was illegal. The idea of contraband was used to describe enslaved people who made it to the lines during the Civil War, and they were referred to as contraband, and they would set up camps. And a great phrase was used to describe enslaved people and their experiences when it came to education. It was every person a teacher, every place a classroom. And it was the idea that people would find ways to get education. So there's anecdotes about enslaved children learning how to sew, but underneath their sewing supplies would be primers that someone had obtained for them. Or they would learn to sing the ABC songs while they were learning crafts because someone knew someone who had learned, who passed along that knowledge. So the history of education in the South, especially for Black Americans, adult and children, is very much about doing anything and everything because for a period of time it was illegal. It was illegal to learn how to read. It was illegal to teach Black children how to read. So that's a whole, so again, Self-Taught by Williams is a great book for people who are interested in that topic.
That almost gives me chills just thinking about the kind of common resistance that was going on in the South from all different fronts.
And you just think about the things that parents did.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who were able to hold on to their children because their enslaver hadn't sold away their children. And Frederick Douglass, who himself learned to read, the wife of his owner, I believe, taught him how to read. And even he acknowledged how unusual that was, that he had been taught to read by a white woman, given that it was mostly illegal at the time.
Mm-hmm. So I guess two very good cultural historians, we can skip past the actual details of the Civil War and all the wonderful war stuff, but we can really kind of start, I'm speaking at least as a historian of England, you don't really see the systemization of education and educational knowledge until probably the later 20th century. Is that true in the United States as well?
There was a push in the mid-1800s, what's referred to as the Common School movement. So one of the things you'll frequently see when folks advocate a single narrative is what's sometimes called the Prussian Model, or the industry model or the factory model. And what happened in the mid 1800s is a number of men who had positions in education, as
Of course.
superintendents of states, of commissioners, they went to Prussia. And they saw things in Prussia that really impressed them, because what Prussia had done was made the collective decision. They basically did what Jefferson wanted. They decided it is better for us to have an educated population than not. So let's figure out a way to educate all of our children, mostly boys. So they brought back these ideas, and the things they brought back with them weren't so much, here's how you do it, so much as it can be done. New York State, the New York State commissioner was one of the men who went to Prussia, and he came back and said, yeah, this is never going to work in New York. Never. Because New York State, we have a very, every state has its own unique system, but New York State, we have what's called the Board of Regents. And the Board of Regents was first founded in 1754, I believe. We are, in New York State, we have the oldest formal system of public education. Massachusetts has the oldest form, like the longest standing structure of public education. Like New York and Massachusetts are always kind of battling it out around education history. Or at least that's how I imagine it. But they came back from Prussia and they saw things that they liked. So around the mid 1800s, there was this idea, we can do this. We can have a system of education that works for all students. We just need to get into the idea of having a common experience. So before that, it was about hodgepodge systems. So, during the Civil War, after the Civil War, it was about these kind of disparate systems. But the idea was coming out, let's make them look similar. At the same time, we had huge waves of immigrants coming in, which meant lots of little bodies. And so we started to fall into this system where children were educated amongst their age-based colleagues, but not everywhere and not all the time. So there were still a number of schools where they had older students teaching younger students. There were still schools where all the grades were together in the same place. But we also went through what's called by historians the feminization of the profession. And it is where we absolutely flipped through strategic conversation from a male profession, the Ichabod Crane model, to the loving and caring and motherly teacher. And the idea emerged that teaching is something that women, mostly white, could do before they got married. And thus began, there was a point in New England where something like 6 out of every 7 young white women had been a teacher at some point.
Wow.
Because that's what you would do. You would become a teacher once you finished, once you not necessarily graduated, because that wasn't really a concept yet, but once you finished perhaps 8th grade, you would teach and then you'd get married and you could no longer be a teacher. Because goodness knows, Brian, women cannot handle being both a teacher and a mother.
It's true facts, isn't it?
She says sarcastically. And that's kind of what they would say. They would say it was too much stress on women's brains, to do both. So the churning was incredible. Like just, kids would have new teachers because the teacher would get married and, go off and do the married life thing. So we flipped into the feminization, which gets us to probably the big shift, which is the early 1900s, which is where we kind of started to really, truly get public education as we think of it today.
So just to pause there for a brief second, I don't know if you managed to listen to the Bedside Rounds podcast that we did.
I did.
So Adam Rodman talks about how they, like you just did, they all went to Germany and they were so impressed by the German system that they decided to import it American schools and so on and so forth. But he only mentions that they bring it into the colleges and the medical universities. But what you're saying is like it's below that level, or maybe even at that level below, I'm not 100% sure, below that level it becomes more feminized and then the higher education is more masculinized.
Yeah, colleges has remained relatively masculine throughout the whole time. But when we talk, especially about, elementary level, I think right now, I don't think the primary school, the demographics of primary school has ever gone below, I'd say 85% female in primary education since since we started keeping demographic data.
So we're about the 1900s, and you start. I think that's right about when the progressive movement gets started, right? Do progressives focus more on U.S. education?
It's, again, because we don't have the 10th Amendment, it's tough. So there are pockets of progressiveness. So, for example, lots of folks are familiar with John Dewey, and John Dewey was a big advocate of, hey, this little person, they're a person. Let's honor who they are as a person. But he wasn't the only person, he wasn't the only educator doing that. A lot of what the feminization of the profession did was push out, to a certain extent, the cruelties of public education to a certain extent. So corporal punishment was the common behavioral management strategy prior to the 1900s. It was probably the most common. It moved farther down the list, but not in all places. I mean, there are still, in 2018, there are schools where parents have to opt out of corporal punishment. I believe Arkansas has a lawsuit about this right now, where parents have to actively write a letter and say, please don't beat my child if they misbehave.
Jeez.
Otherwise, so the progressive movement is an interesting one. There's a number of things that kind of happened around progressive education. So people will put it as it's two sides. There's progressives and then there's traditional. But even the progressives were advocates of some aspects of quote unquote traditional education. So Dewey wasn't anti-lecture. He wasn't anti-knowledge. He was, hey, here's a novel idea. Maybe kids shouldn't be bored at school. Let's try that for a bit and see how that goes. So one of the things that emerged is the idea that kids should move throughout their day. And the kind of the most well-known model of
that comes from the progressive movement.
Kind of, yeah. And what the thing, again, about, because of how big American education is, things didn't get to one school district, to one area of one state until the 1950s, but they were already in place in another part of the country by 1850. So it's always about things that are in one place before they're in another place. So, for example, we now have school districts right now in 2018 that have gone completely ungraded. There are no such thing as grade levels, and kids don't get GPAs. In 20 years, that's going to be a lot more common. And we're going to say, oh, and then schools became this. So there's always folks who are ahead of the curve, as it were. And then there are places that are still, because of a variety of factors, trying to get caught up. So the progressive movement, the probably people most familiar with is something called the Gary Plan. And the Gary Plan had this idea that children should move throughout their day. And they called it the work, study, play plan. So students would learn from a teacher, then they would work on the gardens, and then they would have free time. And it's not the first time children were moving throughout their day, but it became, hey, this can work. It became a model for what can happen for students to kind of move throughout their day and kind of thinking about school a little bit differently. So one of the things that people like to do, and I won't name check here, is they like to say, well, it was about training kids for factories. There's nothing in the historical record to support that claim. Gatto will say the Gary Plan used bells to train kids for factories, when the superintendent of the Gary School District said, I used bells because we had a giant campus and I needed to get everybody's attention. So it's tough because I have a shelf on my bookcase. I call it my white men bookcase, my white men shelf. It is modern authors who say, I know the problem for fixing schools. And chapter 1 is always a history of education. And they'll mention Worth and they'll say, oh, it's for training kids to work in factories. Well, no, not really. So it's my hate read shelf, as it were.
So are you working on your own book? I feel like you might want to.
I think about it sometimes, but I'm still working my way through. There's so many amazing books by educational historians, and what they write about is such a fascinating small slice of American education history. There's a great book that just came out. It's called The Lost Education of Horace Tate by Vanessa Siddell Walker. And what she talks about are all of the Black educators, starting from the 1870s, who have been pushing so hard for integration and desegregation, and the ways in which they tried to decolonize the curriculum, the ways in which they brought in they would pay for resources themselves out of their very measly salaries. And so there's so many great books out there that it's fascinating to me how much of education history there is. I mean, I could be reading a book a day and still not get, through all of the incredible stories there are in American education history.
Well, I will say, just for a voice of confidence, that I think you might want to write a book. I did, like you, I had a very similar nemesis who wrote a book on history of erotica in the mail in the United States, and I just hated it so much I had to write an entire book just to disprove it. So it is a very powerful form of therapy, if you consider it.
I like that. I could call it like the above ground history of American education history.
See, you're halfway there.
Very nice.
So of course Gary is famously, I would say, white, and of course probably famously male. Is it also used for people of color and for women, or sorry, girls?
The answer is always going to be it depends. Mm-hmm. There were some places where there were children or schools that were predominantly attended by children of color, by Black students on the East Coast, that did follow that plan. But at the same time, there were schools like, it's called the M Street High School in Washington, D.C. It's called Dunbar now. The name has changed, that followed a very classical curriculum. So one of the things about Dunbar in D.C. is the teaching staff were some of the most brilliant Black minds America has ever had, because the teachers were physicists and scientists and just philosophers and, amazing, brilliant people who couldn't get jobs because of the color of their skin. So what happened at Dunbar is these folks were hired to teach. And so they taught a classics curriculum, Latin and Greek and philosophy. And so generations of young Black students in DC went through this school learning from some of the most talented minds we've ever had in this country because of the legacy of segregation. So they followed a quote unquote traditional model where you lectured, you did recitations, you read. But there were also schools that followed the more progressive, child-centered kind of model. And truly, I'm not kidding when I say every school building has its own story. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite things about New York State history is you can tell a bit of a school's history based on the name of the district. So in New York State, we have what are called union-free school districts. So you'll see like Smithtown Union-Free. Mm-hmm. And at first blush, it's like, what do you mean? Like there's no teacher unions? Well, what it means is when it started, it was just a high school that wasn't connected to any school district. So what tells us, so the school was founded in 1897, that tells us there's a population boom in that community at that time, such that they had to create a new school just for students who suddenly arrived. I just think that's so fascinating.
That is absolutely fascinating. It makes me wonder about all the schools I grew up in that had these kind of generic names like Underhill and Village and Memorial.
So what state did you grow up in?
I grew up in New Hampshire, a little central New Hampshire. And like Underhill was obviously under the hill that was overlooked the town, but Village it was in the old village of the Hooktown Hookset. And the Memorial would be, I think it probably was founded probably right after World War II, so it might make sense that it would call Memorial.
Yeah. Now, New Hampshire is an interesting state in the current era because New Hampshire is one of our states that's leading the way in what's called competency-based education.
Yes.
I don't know if that term's ever crossed your radar. So the system that we have right now is pretty much in every high school. I mean, not all of them, but most of them. It's time-based education. And what that means is a high schooler has to sit in his seat for a certain number of hours in order to get credit. Mm-hmm. Some states have different systems, but generally speaking, we have this credit system. And it's generally referred to as the Carnegie or the Carnegie Unit, depending on how you want to pronounce his name. And where that came from is Andrew Carnegie was very interested in equalizing college. He wanted to allow more students, by which you mean white men, lower class white men, access to college. And that meant there was some equalizing of what college meant. And in addition, he wanted to fund the retirement funds for college professors. but he would only do it if if it was actually a college. So colleges had to meet certain criteria to be considered a college. A part of that was their admission criteria. So for a period of time, you'd get into a college based on really kind of esoteric, specific to that college. Like to get into Harvard, you had to know a particular, Greek text, but to get into Yale, you had to know a Latin one. Like it was really kind of very unique for a particular college. And so Carnegie had a hand in helping to equalize that. So students now in high school have to get credit in order to demonstrate they've earned a diploma in order to get into college. So that seat time, it's time-based. Children are generally in school until they get the 4 years or, the 16 up to 20 credit hours. Then they have enough credentials to get into college. Competency-based education, which is what New Hampshire is doing, is shifting away from how much time you spend to your abilities. So potentially your relatives in New Hampshire in 15 years, you could have a relative who quote unquote graduates high school when they're 14 because they've learned all that high school can teach them.
And then the average age of Harvard might actually then return to 15.
Yeah, exactly. There are issues about compulsory education laws that do say children need to be in school up until they're 16 or 17 or 18, depending on the state. And so states are having to negotiate that. What do we do with a teenager who's learned all that we can teach them, but yet is still required to go to school? And so they're getting into stuff like internships and stuff like that.
So I kind of want to talk about, of course, we mentioned Carnegie, we mentioned Dewey and Gary. How would you say the educational system has changed itself through probably through World War II and bring us up to maybe close to the modern day?
So after World War II is kind of when we established this idea that every child in America has the right to receive an education. It's a parent's decision how that happens. So compulsory education laws mean that you as a underaged American citizen or non-citizen have the right to become educated. That is your constitutionally protected right. Your parent can choose how to accomplish that. If your parents entrust you to the public education system, then the school district becomes responsible for you during those compulsory education hours. So part of that is after World War II was negotiating what that means in terms of race. So Mississippi was the last state to codify compulsory education laws, 1917, I think. But as soon as the winds started to indicate that desegregation was coming, Mississippi took compulsory education laws off the books. So what that meant was in the 1950s, if a Black parent showed up at a school with their child, a Mississippi school district could legally say, "I'm sorry, we're not going to educate your child."
Wow.
Because they got rid of compulsory education laws. So all of the things that happen around Brown versus Board of Education is just picking up the pattern that I mentioned at the beginning about white parents keeping their children away from Black children. So we have entire school districts in Virginia that shut down following Brown versus Board of Education so that parents wouldn't have to send their children to school with Black children. They were called segregation academies. But it wasn't just a Southern issue. It's also a Northern issue. There's a commentator on NPR, Gene Denby, who will say housing segregation is everything. Because of how segregated the North is and how we do school funding, it is entirely possible to have a 75% white district immediately next door to a 75% Black district, and they have very different funding sources, or funding amounts, as it were. So after World War II, it's very much negotiating who deserves an education in America, and that's the thing we are still fighting to this day.
So yes, I think kind of to draw us to that conclusion, what should listeners take away from the history of education in America?
I think the biggest takeaway has to be if someone is telling you it's one thing, our schools are based on X, immediately cast aspersions upon them. put a hex upon them. But we need to challenge what we think is true. So if we hear someone saying this is why schools are the way they are, generally speaking, that's not the case. It's not that simple. But we have to be incredibly cognizant of the history of white supremacy in our schools, the incredible history of institutional sexism. Teachers are dramatically underpaid in this country for the amount I don't have my doctorate, I'm ABD, but I couldn't teach in New York State till I had my master's. So I had to pay for 2 college degrees before I could get a job, which meant the amount of debt teachers carry around is astronomical in relation to the salaries teachers get. And we have this perception that, teachers, aren't they so wonderful? And there are heroes. No, they're hardworking women and men who deserve a decent salary. So when we talk about teachers as heroes and the sacrifices they make that's institutional sexism writ large. That's about women have this special gift to be teachers. So when people think about American education, we have to be cognizant of American history, which is white supremacy and institutional sexism, and have to, in every way that we can, big and small, kind of challenge those tropes about savior teachers and, hero teachers and why schools are segregated, et cetera, et cetera.
So I kind of want to close by asking you what your favorite episode of your podcast is, because I do recommend that all the listeners here go and start immediately listening to your podcast, because I think it would both teach them and me much more.
I love the episode we did on bells, because that was the episode where I felt the things slide into place as it relates to doing historical research. I'm not fully confident that I have mastered all of the skills. I don't think anyone ever can, but I feel like that's the episode where things really clicked for me. That's the episode where I felt comfortable reaching out to educational historians and asking for recommendations for books to read and asking questions. That's where I started to edit Wikipedia and changing and updating Wikipedia as it relates to American education history. So the bells episode is when I really had a fire lit under me around advocacy that goes beyond just a podcast.
Well, that's great. I definitely agree. I think that was probably one of my favorite episodes of podcasts in general. I think it very well done. So I do want to thank you for joining us today. I think you've given us kind of a comprehensive look from the beginning to where we are today in American education. But I'm sure, as always, this is a very charged conversation and people are so very curious about it. So I know we will have follow-up questions and Ask Historians. So I hope you will come and join us in the thread.
I would be honored to. But thank you so much for inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Oh, this was great. Thank you so much, Jen. This has been fantastic.
Well, thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.